The sound of a single drum in the dead of night was enough to make the most feared men in Georgia abandon their horses and run for their lives. They were the hunters, but now they were the hunted. No one ever saw the drummer, and by the time the sun rose, another rider would be gone forever. But this was not the work of a ghost. It was the work of one man, a man they had gravely underestimated. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Our story begins not with the fear, but with the hope that came before it. In the spring of 1873, Elias Thorne arrived in Havenwood on a current of warm air that carried the scent of pine and baking bread. The dust of the road clung to his worn trousers and the shoulders of his coat, a fine red powder that seemed alien in the lush green of the village. He walked with the steady, measured gait of a man who had covered countless miles, his back straight, his gaze taking in the scene with a quiet, searching intensity. In one hand, he carried a worn leather satchel that held all his worldly possessions. In the other, he gripped a long, cylindrical bundle wrapped in oilcloth, its weight familiar and burdensome. This was his war drum, a companion he had wished to leave behind but could not bring himself to discard. It was a part of him, a repository of rhythms that had driven men to their deaths and held the line against chaos. Havenwood was an oasis of determined life carved from the Georgia wilderness. It was a village of freedmen, a testament to resilience built with sweat and hope. The air hummed with industry, the cheerful shouts of children chasing a runaway hoop down the main thoroughfare mingling with the steady, rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys, promising evening meals. Women tended a large communal garden, their bright headscarves a splash of defiant color against the rich, dark earth. Elias saw all of this, and it felt like a balm on a wound he had carried for years. The metallic tang of gunpowder and the iron scent of blood that haunted his memories seemed to recede, replaced by the wholesome smells of soil and life. He was in his late 20s, but the war had etched a weariness into the lines around his eyes, a quiet gravity that made him seem older. He had served the Union not with a rifle, but with his drumsticks, the heartbeat of the infantry, a living metronome for courage and advance. Now, all he wanted was to forget those cadences, to let the rhythm of war finally fall silent within him. A woman with skin the color of rich mahogany and hair like spun silver emerged from a cabin near the garden, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes, bright and perceptive, found him immediately. "Elias, son," she called, her voice a melody of warmth and strength. It was Mama Rose, the community's unofficial matriarch, a woman whose wisdom was as deep as the roots of the ancient oaks that shaded the village. He managed a small, tired smile as she approached. "Mama, Rose." She took his hands in hers, her grip firm and reassuring. "The war is done with you," she said, her gaze softening as she took in the exhaustion in his eyes. "Let the peace settle in your bones. You've earned it." "I'm trying, Mama Rose," Elias replied, his voice raspy from the road. "Just want to find a quiet place to be, a place where a man can hear himself think." "You've come to the right place, then," she said, patting his hand before releasing it. "There's quiet here, and there's life. Go on. Joseph's been expecting you. The old smithy's got a room for you, clean as a pin." That evening, Elias felt a sense of belonging he hadn't known since before the cannons first roared. He sat at a long table in the open air, part of a community dinner celebrating the planting of the new crops. Laughter and stories swirled around him, weaving a tapestry of shared experience. He met the Carter family, and it was like finding a missing piece of his own heart. Joseph, the blacksmith whose hammer song provided the village's daily rhythm, was a man of immense physical strength and a gentle spirit. His wife, Sarah, had a smile that could coax flowers from stone, and their son, Leo, was a bright-eyed boy of 7 with an insatiable curiosity. Elias found himself talking, sharing small pieces of his journey, the weariness in his soul lifting with each shared smile and passed dish of cornbread. But as the sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the mood shifted. The laughter became more subdued, the conversations more hushed. It was Joseph who gave the shadow a name. "The night riders are getting bolder," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the darkening woods that encircled their small haven. He spoke of outlying farms, of families terrorized in the dead of night, of a fear that was spreading like a sickness through the county. The words hung in the air, a chilling counterpoint to the warmth of the community. Days later, Elias saw them for himself. He was walking at the edge of the village as dusk bled into night, enjoying the cool air. At first, it was just a flicker of light in the distance, a willow, the wisp in the dense pines. Then, the flicker resolved into a column of figures on horseback. They were wrapped in white robes, their faces hidden beneath pointed hoods, their torches cutting jagged holes in the twilight. They moved with an unnatural silence, a menacing procession of ghosts. They did not stop or speak, simply parading past the edge of Havenwood's territory, a silent, potent threat. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in Elias's gut. It was the old anger, the righteous fury he thought he had buried on the battlefields of Virginia, rising from its shallow grave. The sight of them, so arrogant in their anonymity, triggered the deep trauma of the war, not the fear of battle, but the visceral hatred of the tyranny he had fought to destroy. The peace he had so desperately sought felt fragile, a beautiful, fleeting dream about to be shattered by a waking nightmare. The nightmare came on a moonless night. The first sound was a splintering crash, the brutal violation of a family's sanctuary. It was followed by a woman's terrified scream, a sound that ripped through the peaceful night and tore at Elias's soul. He was out of his small room in an instant, his heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. Drawn by the horrific sounds, he moved through the trees at the edge of the village until he could see the Carter's home. He watched from the tree line, a ghost in the shadows, his body shaking with a helpless, consuming fury. He saw them all. The white-robed figures, their forms demonic in the flickering torchlight. He saw them drag Joseph from his home, his powerful body struggling against a dozen hands. He saw the imposing figure of their leader, the Grand Cyclops Beaumont, his voice a guttural roar as he directed his men to plant a crude wooden cross in the family's yard and set it ablaze. The flames leaped into the night, a profane beacon of hatred, casting dancing, monstrous shadows. He saw the raw terror on Joseph's face as he stood between the flames and the door to his home, a human shield protecting Sarah and Leo, whose terrified cries were a constant heart-rending chorus. Elias's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. Every instinct screamed at him to charge, to fight, to unleash the violence that was boiling in his blood. But he knew it would be suicide. More than that, it would be a death sentence for Havenwood. A direct confrontation would bring a massacre, a wave of retribution that would wash away everything this community had built. So he stood, hidden and shaking, and watched as his newfound hope for peace was burned to ashes on a fiery cross. When it was over, when the riders had galloped away, laughing into the darkness, that hope was replaced by something else, something cold and hard and sharp. It was a calculated rage, a strategist's fury. The next day, a somber quiet hung over Havenwood. The community gathered to tend to the Carters, to repair their broken door and soothe their shattered spirits. Elias, however, walked away from the village, away from the comforting words and shared grief. He walked deep into the dense pine woods, the tall trees swallowing the sky, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. He found a small, secluded clearing, and finally unwrapped the oilcloth from his long bundle. The war drum gleamed in the filtered sunlight, its wooden shell and taut hide seeming to hum with a latent energy. He ran a hand over its surface, his mind drifting back to the war. He thought about his role, a role others had often dismissed. He wasn't just keeping time, he was the voice of the battle. A long roll was the advance. A sharp flam was the signal to fire. A frantic, chaotic beat was the retreat. He had controlled the tempo of life and death, striking fear or courage into the hearts of thousands with nothing but a rhythm. He looked around at the woods, truly seeing them for the first time not as a sanctuary, but as an instrument. He understood the acoustics of this place, the way the thick fog that often rolled in at night would muffle and distort sound, the way the towering pines could act as natural amplifiers, making a single noise seem to come from everywhere at once. An idea began to form, a seed of vengeance taking root in the fertile ground of his rage. He would not fight them with a gun, for they had more guns. He would not fight them with fire, for they were masters of it. He would fight them with their own deepest, most primal weapon, fear. He would become a ghost. He would become the phantom that haunted their guilty consciences. He would use his drum not to lead an army of men, but to become a phantom legion in the mind of his enemy. He lifted his sticks, the familiar weight settling in his hands. He began to practice, but it was not the crisp, marching beats of the Union Army. It was something new, something unsettling, a rhythm designed to sound like a nervous heart, a beat to prey on a soul stained with wickedness. It was the rhythm of the hunted, and he would teach it to the hunters. A week later, the woods held a different kind of gathering. Deep within the pines, in a secluded clearing shielded by a thicket of wild rhododendron, the Ku Klux Klan convened. A great bonfire raged at the center, its hungry flames clawing at the night sky, painting the undersides of the pine boughs in a flickering, demonic orange. The heat was intense, and the air was thick with the smell of crackling pitch, sweat, and the sour tang of cheap whiskey being passed from hand to gloved hand. The men, anonymous in their white robes and hoods, were celebrating. Their recent terror campaign had been a resounding success in their eyes, and their laughter was loud and self-satisfied, a brutal sound that echoed unnaturally in the sacred quiet of the forest. At the head of the assembly standing on a large tree stump that served as a makeshift pulpit. His considerable bulk was made even more imposing by his robes, and his voice, filtered through the cloth of his hood, was a booming, authoritative growl that commanded attention. He gestured with a wide, sweeping arm, his words dripping with venomous piety. "They call this land ware construction," he bellowed, and a wave of derisive snorts and jeers answered him. "I call it a perversion, an affront to the natural order. They seek to elevate the savage, to place him on a pedestal beside the civilized man. We are the guardians of that order. We are the righteous hand that will correct this course, that will remind them of their place. What we did to the blacksmith's family was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of instruction, a necessary lesson in the immutable laws of God and nature." He paused, letting his words sink in, letting the men's hatred simmer and boil. He raised a fist. "We are the invisible empire, and our work has only just begun. We will be the cleansing fire, the purifying storm. Let them fear the night, for the night belongs to us." A roar of approval went up from the assembled clansmen. They were invincible, powerful, instruments of a divine and terrible will. They were utterly, fatally wrong. From a rocky ridge overlooking the clearing, hidden by a dense curtain of brush and tangled vines, Elias watched. He lay flat on the cool, damp earth, a phantom in the darkness, his presence as unnoticed as a stone. The fog had begun to roll in, as he knew it would on these humid Georgia nights. It crept through the trees like a living thing, a thick, wet blanket that promised to swallow sound and sight. He had his drum before him, the sticks held loosely in his hands. He took a slow, deep breath, calming the fury in his own heart, channeling it into a cold, focused purpose. Then he began to play. It started with a sound so subtle it was barely perceptible. A single, soft thump, followed by a pause, and then another. Thump, thump, thump. He was using a pair of mallets he had padded with thick layers of felt, softening the initial impact, making the sound less like a drum and more like a disquieting organic pulse. It was just loud enough to exist on the very edge of hearing, a vibration you felt in your bones before your ears could properly name it. Down in the clearing, one of the clansmen, a lanky farmer named Cletus, shifted his weight and cocked his head. "Y'all hear that?" he asked the man next to him. The other man, a boorish braggart named Jeb, took a long pull from a ceramic jug before wiping his mouth on the sleeve of his robe. "Hear what?" "Ain't nothing but the fire and the Grand Cyclops running his mouth." Beaumont, who had been about to launch into another tirade, paused, his head turning slightly. The sound was gone, or perhaps it had never been there at all. He was annoyed by the interruption, by the break in his hypnotic cadence of hate. "Silence in the ranks," he commanded, his voice sharp with irritation. The men fell quiet, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackle and hiss of the bonfire. Then it came again, a little louder this time. Thump, 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 thump. Elias shifted his position, crawling silently 20 yards to his left to another pre-selected spot. The acoustics of the ridge, combined with the thickening fog, were his allies. He slowly, deliberately, began to increase the tempo. The soft heartbeat became a steady, rhythmic beat. Thump, 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 thump. It was a military cadence, the sound of marching feet, but it was slightly off, the rhythm subtly unnatural, designed to unnerve rather than inspire. He moved again, another 30 yards down the ridge, and the sound seemed to jump, the source now appearing to come from a completely different direction. First it was on their left, then it was on their right, then, impossibly, it seemed to be coming from the woods directly in front of them. The arrogance in the clearing began to evaporate like dew in the morning Sunday. The self-satisfied laughter died in their throats. Men shifted uneasily, their hands straying to the pistols tucked into their belts. Their bravado was a thin veneer, and Elias's rhythm was scraping it away. The horses, tethered at the edge of the clearing, were the first to truly panic. They were creatures of instinct, and their instincts screamed that something was profoundly wrong. They began to whinny and pull at their reins, their eyes wide and white in the firelight, their ears swiveling frantically. The men's fear began to feed the horses' fear, and the horses' terror, in turn, amplified the men's. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread. "It's just a trick of the wind in the pines," Jeb shouted, but his voice was thin, lacking all its earlier conviction. "The wind don't keep a beat like that," another man whispered, his voice trembling. "That's a drum, a war drum." Beaumont's fists were clenched at his sides. He was a man accustomed to being the sole source of fear, and this intrusion infuriated him. "It's one man," he roared, trying to project a confidence he no longer felt. "Trying to spook us, a coward hiding in the fog. Find him, and bring him to me." A few of the men, spurred by Beaumont's command and desperate to do something, anything, to break the spell of the unnerving rhythm, untethered their horses. Jeb, eager to restore his tarnished image as a man of action, was the first to mount. "I'll find the coward," he yelled, spurring his horse forward into the fog-choked woods. 2 others followed him, their forms quickly swallowed by the swirling gray mist. The moment they entered the trees, Elias stopped drumming. The sudden, absolute silence was more terrifying than the beat had been. It was as if the world had gone deaf. The men in the clearing held their breath, listening. They could hear the frantic calls of the search party, their voices muffled and distorted by the fog. "Hello? Anything?" The words seemed to hang in the dead air for a moment before being swallowed. A few minutes passed, an eternity of silent, heart-pounding tension. Then, 2 of the riders emerged from the mist, their faces pale, their horses skittish. They had found nothing. No drummer, no tracks, nothing. But Jeb was not with them. He rode off deeper, one of them stammered. "We called for him, but he didn't answer." The drumming did not return. The silence remained, heavy and accusatory. The spell of the night was broken. The Klan's gathering, which had begun with such arrogant celebration, dissolved into a mess of paranoia and chaos. The men scrambled for their horses, their only thought to get away from this cursed clearing, away from the oppressive fog and the memory of that damnable beat. They rode home in small, frightened clusters, their bravado gone, replaced by a gnawing fear of the unknown. The next morning, Jeb's horse was found wandering near the edge of Havenwood, its saddle empty, its coat slick with sweat and trembling uncontrollably. Of Jeb himself, there was no sign. From a safe distance, hidden in the high branches of a cypress tree, Elias had watched it all unfold. He had not laid a hand on Jeb. He hadn't needed to. As the riders entered the woods, he had used a simple slingshot and a handful of pebbles, peppering the rump of Jeb's horse. The already terrified animal had bolted, separating its rider from the others. Elias had then pursued on foot, not chasing the man, but herding the horse, using sharp cracks of a branch against a tree to keep the animal running in a panic, driving it deeper and deeper into the treacherous, swampy part of the woods. He had watched as Jeb, thrown from his mount, had stumbled through the sucking mud, hopelessly lost and disoriented. His panicked shouts growing fainter and fainter. The swamp would do the rest. News of the event spread through the county on whispers and rumors. In Havenwood, it was met with a complex mixture of fear and a dawning, quiet hope. They didn't know what had happened. Not really. But they knew that the Klan's night of terror had been disrupted, that their swagger had been broken, and that one of their own was gone. That evening, Sarah Carter, her face still bearing the faint bruises of her ordeal, spoke to Mama Rose as they tended the communal garden. "They say one of them is gone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just vanished." In the woods, Mama Rose did not stop her work, her hands methodically pulling weeds from around a promising squash plant. She looked towards the dark line of the forest that bordered their village, a knowing, ancient glint in her eye. "The pines have old spirits in 'em," she said, her voice calm and steady. "They've seen a lot of wickedness over the years. They don't take kindly to it. Sometimes they sing a song of their own." Elias overheard the exchange. He felt a grim, cold satisfaction settle in his chest. His plan had worked. He had drawn first blood without firing a shot, but as he saw the flicker of hope in Sarah's eyes, a hope he himself had ignited, he also felt the heavy burden of his secret. He had crossed a line, stepping out of the light and into the shadows. He was no longer just a victim of their hate. He was an active agent against it. And looking at the faces of his friends, at the fragile peace he was fighting to protect, he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. He could not stop now. He had become the ghost in the woods, and his work was far from over. A few nights later, the fog returned with a vengeance. It was a different beast from the last time. Not a creeping mist, but a thick, suffocating presence that clung to the trees and deadened all sound. It was a night for ghosts, a night for secrets. And Grand Cyclops Beaumont, his face a mask of incandescent fury, chose this night to ride again. The loss of Jeb, a man he had personally recruited, was more than an inconvenience. It was a public humiliation. The invisible empire had been challenged, its authority questioned by a phantom beat in the dark, and Beaumont's rage was a palpable thing, a heat that seemed to warp the cold, damp air around him. They were fewer in number this time. The story of Jeb's disappearance had spread through their ranks like a fever, and many had found convenient excuses not to answer the summons. The men who did ride were a tense, grim-faced lot, their earlier bravado replaced by a skittish anxiety. They rode with their hands close to their pistols, their eyes constantly scanning the impenetrable wall of white that surrounded them. The usual boisterous talk was absent, replaced by the muffled clop of hooves on the damp earth and the creak of saddle leather. Among them was a young man named Silas, a recent recruit who had joined more out of pressure from his family than any real conviction. His face, barely a man's, was pale and slick with a cold sweat, and his hands trembled so violently on the reins that his horse shifted nervously beneath him. He was regretting every decision that had led him to this moment, to this terrifying, fog-shrouded ride. Beaumont had declared their target with a chilling finality. They were going to burn the community's church to the ground. It was to be an act of overwhelming retribution, a statement that no challenge, real or imagined, would go unpunished. This time, Elias did not wait for them to reach their destination. He had anticipated their path, their need to strike at the heart of Havenwood. As their nervous procession drew within a mile of the village, the drumming began. It was not the subtle, unnerving heartbeat of before. This was something else entirely. It was louder, more complex, a furious and intricate assault on the senses. Elias had found a place he had scouted for just such an occasion. A shallow cave, hidden behind a small, cascading waterfall at the base of a steep ravine. The rock walls and the curtain of falling water created a booming, echoing resonance. A natural amphitheater of terror. He unleashed a torrent of sound, a series of rapid rolling strikes, complex paradiddles and sharp cracking flams that he had perfected in the heat of battle. He was not mimicking a single drummer. He was mimicking a full company of them, the sound that signaled a massive infantry advance, a wall of disciplined, marching men about to crest a hill and descend with bayonets fixed. The sound, amplified and distorted by the cave and the fog, seemed to come from everywhere at once, a massive, otherworldly symphony of impending violence. For the clansmen, already stretched to their breaking point, the effect was devastating. The sound of a single, ghostly drum had been unnerving, but this was the sound of an army. This was the sound of a battle they could not possibly win. Silas looked as though he was about to be physically sick, his knuckles white as he gripped his saddle horn. The Phantom Legion was on the march. "It's a trick, an echo," Beaumont roared, his voice tight with a fury that was beginning to curdle into fear. He spurred his horse, trying to force the column forward through sheer will. "It's the fog. It's playing tricks on your ears. Hold the line, you cowards." But his words were swallowed by the thunderous rolling beat. "It sounds like a whole regiment," Silas cried out, his voice cracking with terror. "We can't fight a whole regiment. This is a trap." The line wavered, then broke. The plan to burn the church was forgotten, replaced by a singular, primal instinct: survival. The men turned their horses, a chaotic scramble of panicked limbs and wide, terrified eyes. They would not be caught in this phantom ambush. They would retreat to their own ground, to the clearing where they had last gathered, a place they foolishly still considered safe. They would make their stand there, where they could see their enemy. They galloped away from the sound, away from the phantom army, fleeing back into the woods, their mission of terror utterly shattered. Their retreat was a frantic, desperate affair. When they finally burst into the familiar clearing, their horses heaving and lathered, they expected to find a sanctuary. Instead, they found a new and more insidious form of violation. The large bonfire pit at the center of the clearing was cold. The ashes stirred and scattered as if someone had been searching for something within them. The air was still and silent, the drumming having ceased the moment their retreat began. But it was not the disturbed fire pit that stopped them cold, that made the blood freeze in their veins. It was the tracks, circling the entire clearing, Pressed deep into the damp, soft earth was a single set of barefoot prints. Elias had been there hours earlier. Before the fog had even settled, he had walked slowly, deliberately, around the perimeter of their unholy ground, his bare feet leaving a clear and undeniable record of his presence. He had made the prints deep, pressing down with all his weight to suggest a man of immense size and heaviness. He circled the clearing twice, a silent, methodical patrol. Then, at the base of a massive, ancient pine tree whose branches clawed at the sky, the prints simply stopped. They did not lead away. They did not scuff or fade. They ended as abruptly as if the person who had made them had been absorbed into the wood of the tree itself, or had ascended into the sky without leaving a trace. This was the turning point. The threat was no longer just an ephemeral sound in the fog. It now had a physical, yet utterly impossible, manifestation. This was not the work of a man hiding in the woods. This was the work of a creature, a spirit, a thing that defied the laws of nature. The fear that had been a sharp, immediate thing became a deep, soul-crushing dread. They were not being hunted by a man, they were being haunted. As the clansmen stood frozen, staring at the impossible tracks, their minds struggling to comprehend what their eyes were seeing, the drumming started again. This time, it was not distant. It was immediate. Right behind them, seeming to emanate from the very trees that bordered the clearing. It was a sharp, aggressive, angry staccato, a burst of violent sound that shattered the last of their composure. It was the signal for a charge. The clearing exploded into pure pandemonium. Horses reared, screaming in terror, their riders clinging on for dear life. Men shouted, their voices shrill with panic. In the ensuing chaos, a particularly cruel clansman named Marcus, a man known for his viciousness, was thrown from his bucking horse. He landed hard, the impact knocking the wind from him, leaving him dazed and gasping on the ground. The source of the sound was Elias, but he was not on the ground. He was perched high in the branches of the great pine tree where the footprints had ended, concealed by the thick needles and the swirling fog. He had no drum with him. The sound they heard was a clever, brutal piece of theater. He had hauled a heavy canvas bag filled with rocks up into the tree with him, tied to a length of rope. He was swinging it rhythmically, smashing it against the thick, resonant trunk of the pine, turning the entire tree into a massive, terrifying instrument. The sound was raw, powerful, and utterly terrifying. As Marcus fell, Elias acted. The drumming stopped. He dropped silently from his perch, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He landed with a soft thud on the pine needles, his movements swift and silent. Before any of the other panicked clansmen could even register what was happening, he was on Marcus. He didn't harm the man, who was still struggling to draw a breath. He simply grabbed the front of the man's white robe, and with a powerful heave, dragged him out of the firelight and into the concealing embrace of the fog. It took less than 5 seconds. By the time anyone looked towards the spot where Marcus had fallen, there was nothing there but trampled earth. The man had vanished. The next day, Marcus was found wandering on a road miles away, his mind fractured, his speech a babble of incoherent terrors. He could only repeat one phrase over and over, a shadow with no face. But his clan robe, the symbol of his power and cruelty, was discovered in the clearing. It was hanging from the highest branch of the giant pine tree, flapping lazily in the breeze like a ghostly white flag of surrender, a final, mocking testament to the phantom's victory. The story spread like wildfire, carried on the winds of rumor and fear, whispered in taverns and general stores, in church pews and over backyard fences. It leaped across the invisible lines that divided the county, taking root in the imaginations of black and white communities alike. The Phantom of the Pines was given a name, a title born of fear and awe: the War Drummer. The legend grew with each telling. Some said he was the ghost of a Union soldier, one of the thousands who had fallen in the bloody campaigns around Atlanta, his spirit now seeking vengeance on the unrepentant rebels. Others, their imaginations darker, whispered that he was a demon summoned from the murky depths of the Okefenokee swamp, a creature of mud and shadow who fed on the souls of wicked men. They say he walks without a sound, one farmer would tell another over a shared jug, his eyes wide, and beats a drum that can curdle your blood and stop your heart. In Havenwood, the transformation was profound. The fear that had been their constant companion, the heavy blanket that had smothered their joy, was almost entirely replaced by a sense of defiant pride and wondrous awe. They were being protected. A guardian, a spirit of their own, had risen from the woods to fight for them. They walked with their heads held a little higher, a secret, shared smile passing between them when they heard the latest wild tale of the war drummer's exploits. Elias moved among them, a quiet, watchful presence. He saw the hope he had kindled blossom into a defiant flame, and it brought him a deep, fierce satisfaction. But it was a victory he could not claim, a triumph he could not share. He listened to the stories, to the legends they were building around his actions, and felt the growing weight of his isolation. He was the hero of the story, but he was also its prisoner. He was becoming the ghost everyone believed him to be, a solitary figure defined by the fear he created. A man alone with the rhythm of his secret war. The Ku Klux Klan in Havenwood was no longer an army. It was a wound, turning septic. The invisible empire had been rendered transparent by fear, its numbers dwindling from a confident host to a mere handful of shivering acolytes. Grand Cyclops Beaumont, a man whose authority had been as absolute as a hangman's noose, now found it crumbling through his fingers like dry soil. His booming pronouncements had been replaced by a low, paranoid growl. His eyes, once burning with righteous fury, were now clouded with a feverish, obsessive dread. The war drummer had done more than spook his men. He had infected them with a suspicion that was now eating the organization alive from the inside. Beaumont forbade any more rides into the fog. The woods, once their sanctuary and stage, had become the enemy's territory. Instead, he called a secret meeting, a desperate attempt to staunch the bleeding and reassert his control. He chose a place he believed to be secure, an abandoned tobacco barn that stood skeletal and alone on the far edge of his own sprawling property. It was a place of ghosts, but they were old ghosts, the familiar spirits of commerce and labor, not the new terrifying phantom that haunted the pines. The men who gathered there were the last of the faithful, or perhaps just the most terrified of leaving. They huddled together inside the cavernous structure, their white robes looking pale and flimsy in the gloom. The air was thick with the dust of decades, carrying the faint, sweet, and melancholy scent of long-dried tobacco leaves. Moonlight, cold and white, streamed through the cracks between the warped wooden slats of the walls, creating a cage of light and shadow that trapped them as surely as any iron bars. Their faces, visible through the eye-holes of their hoods, were drawn and pale, their gazes darting nervously into the dark corners, where the rafters disappeared into absolute blackness. For the first hour there was only silence. It was a heavy, listening silence, punctuated by the scuttling of unseen rodents in the walls and the mournful sigh of the wind through the eaves. Slowly, tentatively, the men began to relax. The security of the barn, so far from the dreaded woods, began to feel real. Beaumont, standing on a stack of old pallets, sensed the shift. He saw his chance to reclaim them. His voice, when he spoke, was not the thunderous bellow of the clearing, but a conspiratorial hiss. "He has made us afraid of our own shadows," Beaumont began, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "He has used tricks, echoes, and fog, the tools of a coward, to make you forget your strength, your purpose. But he is just a man, one man, and we have allowed him to paralyze us." He leaned forward, his masked face a pale skull in the gloom. "No more. We will not be his prey. We will go to the sheriff. We will form a legal posse, sanctioned by the law of this county. We will hunt him down not as night riders, but as deputies of the peace. We will drag this drummer out into the light and show everyone what he is." A flicker of the old confidence returned to the eyes of his men. It was a solid plan, a return to the world of law and order they claimed to represent. They were not murderers in the dark. They were civic leaders. The thought was comforting. The tension in the barn began to ease. Then it came, a single, deafening, explosive boom against the main barn door. It was not a knock. It was a physical blow of such concussive force that the entire structure shuddered. Dust rained down from the rafters, and the men cried out, stumbling back as if they had been struck themselves. Outside, in the darkness, Elias stood with his feet planted wide. He held no drum. His instrument was the barn itself. In his hands, he gripped a heavy wooden mallet, a fence post driver he had taken from a broken-down fence line. He had swung it like a battering ram, putting all of his strength, all of his cold, focused rage, into the blow. He waited a few heartbeats, letting the echo of the impact fade, letting the terror inside build. Then he moved. He circled the barn, his bare feet making no sound on the soft earth. He swung the mallet again, this time against the side wall, another tremendous boom that seemed to answer the first. He moved again and again, striking the walls at random intervals, creating a disorienting and terrifying cacophony. He then began to throw handfuls of heavy stones up onto the vast, rusting tin roof. The sharp, metallic clatter sounded like a sudden, violent hailstorm, then like a scattered volley of gunfire. The rhythm was pure chaos. It was unpredictable, surrounding them, seeming to come from the walls, the roof, the very foundations of the building. It was not the sound of a man. It was the sound of the world being torn apart around them. Inside, it was pandemonium. The men were screaming, their carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. They were trapped in the belly of a giant, angry drum, and the drummer was everywhere at once. They were convinced he was on the roof, just outside the walls, under the floorboards. They drew their pistols, their hands shaking. But there was nothing to shoot at, only the shuddering walls and the terrifying, relentless noise. The paranoia that had been simmering for weeks boiled over, and their fear, having no external target, turned inward. "It's a trap," one of the men shrieked, his voice cracking into a sob. "One of us led him here. It has to be. He knew we were here." Silas, the young, reluctant Klansman, finally broke. His body was racked with violent tremors, and he fell to his knees, tearing at his hood as if it were choking him. "It's a judgment," he wailed, his voice raw with terror and guilt. "We are cursed. I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this." Beaumont, his own sanity fraying, saw his authority dissolving in the acid of their terror. He lunged forward and grabbed Silas by the front of his robe, hauling him to his feet. His eyes, visible through the slits of his mask, were wild, incandescent with a desperate fury. "Hold your nerve, you coward," he snarled, his face inches from Silas's. "It's one man. He's toying with us. He's just one man." Silas stared back at him, his face a mess of tears and sweat, his eyes cleared by the absolute certainty of his terror. "He's not a man," he screamed back, his voice filled with a chilling, prophetic conviction. "He's a spirit of vengeance. He's the wrath of God, and he's come for us all." Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the cacophony stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was more profound, more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a dead, listening silence, thick with the smell of gunpowder from a pistol. One of the men had fired blindly into the ceiling. The only sound was the ragged, panicked breathing of the men and the frantic, terrified thumping of their own hearts. They stood frozen, staring at each other with wide, accusatory eyes, their pistols held limply in their hands. A low, groaning creak cut through the tension. The main barn door, the one that had received the first thunderous blow, was swinging slowly inward on its rusted hinges. It opened into the blackness of the night, revealing nothing but an empty threshold. No one was there. Elias, hidden in the darkness 20 feet away, slowly drew back the long, thin pole he had used to push the door open. He watched, his breath held. The men inside stared at the empty doorway, at the square of night that seemed to be staring back at them. Then, a single sliver of moonlight caught something on the dusty threshold. It was a small metallic glint. For a long moment, no one moved. They were like a herd of deer, paralyzed by a scent on the wind. Finally, Beaumont, his movements stiff and jerky, pushed past the others. He strode to the doorway and bent down, his large frame blocking the opening. When he straightened up, he held a small object in the palm of his gloved hand. He brought it close to his face, his eyes narrowing. It was a brass button, tarnished with age and green with verdigris, but the emblem was still clear, an eagle clutching arrows and an olive branch. It was a button from the uniform of a Union Army soldier. Elias had left his calling card. This was not a random spirit of the swamp. This was not a demon. This was personal. This was a soldier's ghost. For Beaumont, a former major in the Confederate Army, a man who had built his entire post-war identity on the smoldering embers of his hatred for the Union, this was the ultimate psychological blow. The button was a direct message, a piece of the past he had tried to bury, now unearthed and thrown at his feet. He was not just being haunted by a phantom, He was being haunted by his defeat. He was being hunted by the very cause he had fought and lost against. His simmering obsession, which had been a diffuse, paranoid thing, now solidified into a hard, sharp point. He had a face for his ghost. It was the face of every blue-coated soldier he had ever seen across a battlefield, and he knew, with a certainty, that burned away all his fear and left only pure, unadulterated hatred, that he had to destroy this phantom. For the others, the button was the final, incomprehensible straw. This was a level of supernatural warfare they were not equipped to handle. Their enemy was not just a man, not just a spirit, but a ghost with a history, a ghost with a grievance. Silas was the first to act. With a choked sob, he tore the white robe from his body, throwing the hated garment to the dusty floor. He turned and ran, stumbling out of the open barn door and into the blessed anonymity of the night, his wails trailing behind him. His act of desertion broke the spell. 2 other men, their faces ashen, immediately followed his lead. They dropped their hoods and their robes where they stood, discarding their allegiance like a snake shedding its skin, and fled into the darkness. They were done. The war drummer could have the night. He could have the woods. He could have it all. The Ku Klux Klan, as a functional, terrifying force in the county, was broken. It had rotted from the inside out, its own guilt and fear expertly wielded against it as a weapon. Beaumont was left standing in the center of the barn, the Union button clutched in his fist, surrounded by a few of his most fanatical, most terrified followers. His invisible empire had collapsed, its members scattered to the wind, leaving him alone in the dark with the ghost of his own war. Days later, the county was a place of whispers. The story of the barn, the Union button, and the mass desertion had bled out into the general consciousness, becoming another verse in the terrifying ballad of the war drummer. For Grand Cyclops Beaumont, however, it was not a story. It was a fever. He had retreated to his sprawling farmhouse, a man besieged not by an army, but by his own unraveling mind. Sleep offered no refuge. Only disjointed nightmares of brass buttons and chaotic, thunderous rhythms. He had not slept in what felt like weeks, and the man who stalked the halls of his home was a gaunt, hollowed out caricature of the imposing figure who had once commanded such fear. His eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, burned with a feverish yellow intensity, the fire of a man whose entire world had been reduced to a single, all-consuming obsession. He had to force the drummer to show himself. The ghost had to be given flesh so that it could be made to bleed. His desperation finally coalesced into a plan, a gambit so reckless and brutal it could only be born from a mind on the verge of collapse. He would not hunt the ghost in the fog. He would draw the ghost to him. He would take a hostage. He sent word to the 3 remaining followers who had not fled the barn, men so deeply entangled in his web of hate, or so terrified of the consequences of leaving, that they still answered his call. They met not in secret, but in the open, under the harsh light of midday, their faces grim and pale. The attack came with a shocking, brutal efficiency. Joseph Carter was at his smithy, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on hot iron a familiar and comforting heartbeat for Havenwood. The air was filled with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. Children played in the street nearby, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the blacksmith's work. Suddenly, a wagon thundered down the road and screeched to a halt in a cloud of dust. Beaumont, his face a contorted mask of rage, leaped down, a heavy pistol in his hand. His 3 men followed, their movements jerky and uncertain, but they obeyed. Joseph had no time to react. He looked up from his anvil, his powerful arms slick with sweat, and saw the 4 men descending on him. He reached for a heavy hammer, a warrior's instinct taking over. But he was too slow. They swarmed him, the sheer weight of their numbers overwhelming his strength. He fought back with the fury of a cornered bear, but a brutal pistol whip to the side of his head sent him staggering. They bound his hands and feet with rough rope and threw him into the back of the wagon like a sack of grain. The entire violent episode took less than a minute. Sarah's scream from the doorway of their cabin was a sound of pure, undiluted agony. Beaumont, his chest heaving, his eyes wild, did not spare her a glance. He grabbed a young boy who had been frozen in terror, watching the scene unfold. He shoved a crumpled piece of paper into the child's trembling hand. "Take this to the village," he snarled, his voice a ragged rasp. "Give it to anyone. Tell them. Tell your ghost to come for him. We will be in the clearing, the place where it all began. If he's real, let him face me. If not, the blacksmith will pay the price for his defiance." He climbed back onto the wagon, and with a sharp crack of the whip, they thundered away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a community paralyzed by shock and a new, sharper kind of fear. The news fell upon Havenwood like a physical blow. The hope that had been so carefully nurtured over the past weeks curdled into a cold, sickening dread. They were helpless. To try and rescue Joseph would be to walk into a massacre. Their only protector was a phantom, a spirit of the woods, and no one knew if that spirit could stand against 4 armed men in the light of day. Elias felt the news in his gut, a surge of cold, white-hot fury that threatened to consume him. This was it, the end game. Beaumont, in his madness, had forced his hand. Every instinct screamed at him to take a rifle, to go to that clearing and unleash the soldiers' violence he had kept locked away for so long. But as he looked at the terrified faces around him, he knew that was exactly what Beaumont wanted. A gunfight would give the monster a justification, a story he could twist into a narrative of his own heroism. It would turn Elias from a ghost into a simple killer, and it would bring the full legal weight of the county down on all of them. No, he had started this war on his own terms, and he would finish it on his own terms. He would not become the monster he was hunting. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, the fog rolled in. It was thicker and more oppressive than ever before, a suffocating white sea that swallowed the world. It was as if the heavens themselves were setting the stage for the final act. In the clearing, Beaumont and his 3 remaining men stood around a newly built fire, their forms shifting and uncertain in the swirling mist. Joseph was tied to the same large pine tree where the barefoot prince had vanished, his face bruised and swollen. But his eyes, when they caught the firelight, were steady and defiant. The woods were silent. The air was dead and heavy, each man's breath pluming in the cold. The clansmen were on edge, their nerves stretched taut as violin strings. Then, the drumming began. It was a rhythm they had never heard before. It was not the unnerving heartbeat, nor the thunderous advance, nor the chaotic assault. This was a slow, deep, profoundly sorrowful beat, a military funeral dirge. It was the sound of a slow march to an open grave, the final, measured cadence of death. Each deep, resonant thump of the drum seemed to make the very air grow heavy with grief, a lament for a life about to be extinguished. It spoke of finality, of endings, of the cold, silent earth. It was the saddest, most terrifying sound in the world. The three Klansmen, their courage already worn down to a nub, felt the funereal rhythm in their bones. This was not an attack. It was a promise. It was not a threat of a fight. It was a pronouncement of their doom. The ghost was not coming to battle them. It was coming to bury them. "I can't take this," one of them whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "It's like he's digging our graves. I can hear the shovels in the dirt." Beaumont, however, was energized by the sound. This was it, the confrontation. "Show yourself, you coward," he screamed, his voice raw and cracking as he bellowed into the impenetrable wall of fog. He brandished his pistol, waving it wildly at the unseen enemy. "Face me like a man. Stop hiding in the shadows and face me." From his bonds, Joseph Carter lifted his head. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, cutting through Beaumont's frantic shrieks with an unnerving calm. "You are not fighting a man, Beaumont," he said, his gaze fixed on the unhinged leader. "You are fighting the echoes of every wicked thing you have ever done, and tonight they have all come home." Elias remained unseen, a ghost in the machine of the forest. He had spent the entire afternoon setting up his orchestra of fear. The funeral dirge, played on his war drum from a ridge high above them, was merely the anchor, the steady, sorrowful heartbeat of the performance. All around the clearing, the woods themselves were coming alive. He had strung tripwires made of tough, flexible vines across the game trails leading into the area. Tied to them were strings of dried gourds he had hollowed out and filled with pebbles. As the nervous Klansmen shifted their feet, they would trigger them, creating a dry, rattling sound like skeletal fingers drumming on a coffin lid. He had wedged thin, flexible sheets of scrap metal, stolen from a collapsed shed, high in the branches of the trees. When the wind, which was beginning to pick up, blew through them, they vibrated with a low, mournful moan, a sound like a giant in its death throes. His masterpiece was a long, hollowed-out log he had found. Positioning it at the mouth of a small overhang of rock, by blowing across the opening, he could create a deep, resonant echo that sounded like a giant's groan, a sound of immense and ancient sorrow. The dirge was the anchor, but the woods now whispered, rattled, and groaned from every direction. It sounded as if the entire forest was mourning a death that was about to happen. Their death. The symphony of fear reached its crescendo. A branch, which Elias had partially sawn through earlier in the day, finally gave way under its own weight. It cracked with the sound of a rifle shot and crashed to the ground with a deafening roar just yards from the fire. That was all it took. The spell of Beaumont's authority, already stretched to the breaking point, snapped. One of the Klansmen, his mind finally broken by the relentless psychological assault, screamed a high, thin, animal sound and fired his pistol wildly into the fog. The gunshot, a real sound in a world of phantom noises, was the starting pistol for their flight. The three remaining Klansmen broke. All thoughts of loyalty, of their cause, of their leader, were incinerated in the pure, primal fire of their terror. They dropped their torches and their guns, scrambling over each other in a desperate, pathetic attempt to get away from the clearing, away from the soul, crushing sound, and away from their mad leader who had led them into the mouth of hell. They fled into the fog, their terrified screams quickly swallowed by the mist, abandoning Beaumont completely. Beaumont was left alone, standing in the flickering firelight with his hostage. And then, the cacophony of the woods began to subside. The moaning of the metal sheets faded as the wind died down. The rattling of the gourds fell silent. The funeral drumming, the anchor of it all, began to slow. The beat became more and more deliberate, each thump separated by a long, listening silence. Thump, pause, thump, pause, until there was one final, resonant boom that echoed through the clearing and seemed to hang in the air forever. And then, absolute silence. The silence was Beaumont's true and final defeat. It was more profound than any attack, more damning than any accusation. The ghost, the war drummer, would not give him the satisfaction of a physical fight. It had proven its power, dismantled his empire, and broken his mind without ever showing its face. Now, it denied him even its presence. He had been judged, found wanting, and dismissed as irrelevant. He was not worth fighting. He was not worth killing. He was simply nothing. A sound of pure, impotent rage tore itself from Beaumont's throat. He screamed until he was hoarse, a wild, animalistic cry of frustration and utter defeat. He screamed at the silent trees, at the mocking fog, at the ghost who refused to grant him a final, violent release. When his voice was spent, he stood panting, his body trembling, a man utterly broken. His wild eyes fell upon Joseph, still tied to the tree, watching him with a calm, pitying gaze. The sight seemed to drain the last of the fight from him. Defeated, broken, and utterly alone, Beaumont stumbled forward. His hands shook as he fumbled with the knife at his belt and sawed through Joseph's ropes. "Get out of here," he rasped, his voice a dead, hollow whisper. He did not look at Joseph. He could not. He turned and stumbled away in the opposite direction, a man swallowed by the darkness he had so eagerly created, his own ghost now, destined to haunt the ruins of his own life. Joseph Carter walked out of the fog-shrouded woods not as a victim, but as a man returning from a war he had not started but had seen finished. He did not run. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, his bruised face held high, the broken rope still dangling from his wrists like grim trophies. The first person to see him was Sarah, who had been standing a silent, tearless vigil at the edge of the village since he had been taken. A cry, not of grief, but of pure, unadulterated relief, tore from her throat, and she ran to him, collapsing into his arms. The cry was a signal, and in moments, the entire community of Havenwood poured from their cabins, their faces a mixture of disbelief, awe, and overwhelming joy. They surrounded him, their hands reaching out to touch his arm, his shoulder, as if to confirm he was real, that he had truly returned from the land of the dead. He told them what had happened, his voice low and steady as he stood in the center of the gathered crowd, his arm wrapped tightly around his wife. He spoke of the funeral dirge that had risen from the fog, a sound of such profound sorrow it had seemed to make the very trees weep. He described the symphony of terror that followed, the rattles and groans, the feeling that the entire forest had turned against his captors. He told them how Beaumont's men, their minds broken by the psychological assault, had thrown down their weapons and fled into the night like frightened children. And he told them of the final, crushing silence, the moment the ghost had judged their leader and found him unworthy of even a final confrontation. He described how Beaumont, a man utterly defeated and alone, had cut his ropes and stumbled away into the darkness. A man swallowed by his own hate. He did not mention seeing Elias. He did not have to. As he spoke, the eyes of the community drifted, one by one, towards the quiet figure standing at the back of the crowd. The man who had returned from a different war, the man who had brought his own peace to their valley. No words were needed. The truth settled between them, unspoken but as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of that night solidified into legend. The Ku Klux Klan was gone from the region, not just from Havenwood, but from the entire county. Their power, built on fear and intimidation, had been so completely and bizarrely broken that it could not be rebuilt. Some of the members, like the young, terrified Silas, were said to have simply packed their belongings and fled the county, seeking a place where the trees did not whisper and the night did not hold a rhythm of judgment. Others tried to quietly rejoin society, their faces forever marked by a private shame and a lingering, deep-seated fear of the dark, and the sound of a distant drum, and of Grand Cyclops Beaumont, the man who had been the very embodiment of their terror. There was nothing. He was never seen or heard from again. No body was ever found. He had simply vanished. A ghost of a different sort, his disappearance a final, chilling testament to the power that had risen from the pines to oppose him. He became a cautionary tale whispered by parents to unruly children, a man who had been consumed by the very shadows he sought to command. Life in Havenwood returned, but it was not the same as before. The peace they now enjoyed was not the fragile, hopeful peace of a people praying for quiet. It was the resilient, earned peace of a people who had faced down darkness and won. It was a peace that had steel in its spine. Elias Thorne became a part of that peace, a silent guardian who had traded his phantom mantle for the simple, honest sweat of a blacksmith's apprentice. He worked alongside Joseph at the smithy. His strong arms, which had once beaten out rhythms of war and terror, now hammered glowing iron into plowshares and hinges, beating out a new rhythm of creation, not destruction. The steady, ringing clang of his hammer was a new song for the village, a song of rebuilding and strength. One cool, clear afternoon, when the autumn leaves were turning to gold and crimson, Elias climbed the ladder into the small loft of his cabin. He moved with a quiet reverence, a man performing a sacred rite. He reached for his war drum, which had been resting in a corner, and ran his hand over its taut hide one last time. He felt the faint, latent vibration within it, the memory of all the beats it had held, the marches, the charges, the dirges. It had served its purpose. It had been his sword and his shield, his voice when he had none. But that war was over. He carefully, methodically, wrapped the drum in its oilcloth shroud, the material cool and smooth beneath his fingers. He tied the drawstrings tight, sealing the rhythms of the past away. Then, he lifted the heavy bundle and placed it high in the rafters, nestled in the deep shadows where the roof met the wall. Its purpose was served. He was no longer the war drummer. He was just Elias. As he climbed back down the ladder, He felt a profound weight lift from his shoulders, a tension he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there. He stepped out of his cabin into the golden afternoon light, and for the first time in years, he was seen to smile, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his weary eyes and filled them with a quiet, peaceful light. The ghosts of the war, and the ghosts he had created, were finally at rest. He found a new rhythm, a new purpose, not in the cadence of war, but in the bright, curious faces of Havenwood's children. He began to teach them, gathering them in the shade of a great oak tree when their chores were done. He taught them to read and write, to form their letters with charcoal on scraps of slate, opening up a world of words and ideas that had been denied to their parents. But he also taught them other things. He taught them to identify the trees by their bark and their leaves, to read the stories the land told in its tracks and trails, to understand the quiet, immense power of ingenuity over brute force. He taught them that the sharpest weapon was a sharp mind, and the strongest shield was a united community. One day, Leo Carter, his eyes bright with a hero worship he made no attempt to hide, came to him with a small gourd, dried and hollowed out. "Mr. Elias," he said, his voice full of a boy's earnestness, "can you teach me to play? Can you teach me to play like the war drummer?" Elias looked at the boy, at his innocent, eager face, and felt a wave of gentle affection. He knelt down so he was at Leo's level, his expression soft. He took the gourd and a piece of cured animal hide he had been saving, and with patient, careful hands, he showed the boy how to stretch the skin taut across the opening, how to bind it with twine to create a small, simple drum. He fashioned a pair of small drumsticks from willow branches. He handed the finished instrument to the boy, whose eyes were wide with wonder. "I'll teach you something much better," Elias said, his voice a low, warm murmur. He tapped a gentle, steady rhythm on the boy's drum, a simple, happy beat that sounded like a joyful heart. "I'll teach you how to play the rhythm of a peaceful heart, little one. That's a much stronger beat. It's the one that builds things up, instead of tearing them down." Mama Rose found him later that week, sitting by the creek that bordered the village, skipping smooth, flat stones across the water's surface. They skipped and danced, creating a series of widening ripples that spread until they touched the opposite bank. She sat beside him on the grassy bank, her presence a comfortable, familiar silence. They didn't speak for a long time, simply watching the water flow, listening to the gentle song of the creek and the rustle of the wind in the pines. Finally, she spoke, her voice as calm and steady as the creek itself. "The pines sing a different song now, Elias," she said, her gaze fixed on the dark wall of trees across the water. "A song of peace." Elias watched another stone skip across the water, its journey a brief, perfect dance. He looked at her then, at her wise, knowing eyes, and a deep, unspoken understanding passed between them. He had never told her, and she had never asked, but she knew. She had always known. "Sometimes," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the sound of the water, "you have to give the song a start, Mama Rose. The rest of the woods will learn to sing along." Years passed. Havenwood thrived. It became a beacon of black prosperity and resilience in a state that was still hostile and unforgiving. It grew, attracting new families who sought a place of safety and opportunity, a place where they could build a life without fear of the night riders. The story of its founding, of the terror that had almost destroyed it, was passed down from generation to generation, and with it, the story of the war drummer became a local legend, a piece of folklore woven into the very fabric of the community. It was a cautionary tale told to wide-eyed children, a story for those who would bring hate into the pines, a warning that the woods themselves would rise up to defend the innocent. But for the people of Havenwood, it was more than that. It was a story of hope, a testament to the courage of their ancestors. The Ku Klux Klan never returned to Havenwood. The fear they had wielded as their primary weapon had been turned back on them, not by an army with guns and cannons, but by the courage and cunning of a single quiet man. Elias Thorne lived a long and peaceful life in the village he had saved. He married, raised a family, and became a respected elder, his wisdom a guiding light for the community. He proved that the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or a gun, but the rhythm of a defiant heart, and that sometimes the deepest and most lasting mark you can leave on the world is the silence where terror used to be. The sound of his war drum faded into memory, but its echo, the echo of freedom, would last forever.